The Arcturus diplomatic station hung in the void like a massive crystal flower, its petals stretching across 17 kilometers of space, where 40 different species had gathered to witness humanity's introduction to the Galactic Council Gunnery Sergeant Marcus. Chun stood at parade rest in the observation deck. His dress blues crisp and perfect, despite the 6-week journey from Earth. And around him the assembled delegates whispered in a dozen languages about the newcomers from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The humans were small compared to most species present, their frames looking almost fragile next to the towering Kalrathi warriors or the massive bulk of the Thorian delegates. But Chun had learned long ago that looking dangerous and being dangerous were two entirely different things. Ambassador Williams was speaking now, her voice calm and professional as she outlined Earth's proposed contributions to the Council's defense network, talking about human manufacturing capacity and the tactical innovations that humanity could bring to the galactic community. The Kalrathi delegation sat in the front section, their exoskeletal armor gleaming under the station's lights. Each warrior standing nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms that ended in natural weapons evolution had perfected over millions of years. Their leader was Warcast Throkkanen, a decorated champion who had fought in 17 campaigns across the Rim territories. And his translator device crackled with barely concealed contempt every time the ambassador mentioned human military capabilities. Chun kept his eyes forward and his face neutral, a skill every Marine learned in boot camp and perfected through years of dealing with officers who thought they knew better than the boots on the ground. Presentation moved to tactical demonstrations. Holographic displays showing human combat formations and weapon systems that drew polite interest from most delegates and outright sneers from the Kalrathi section. Your formations lack depth, Throkkanen's translator announced suddenly, interrupting the presentation with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Any competent force would collapse your flanks in the first engagement. Ambassador Williams paused, her jaw tightening slightly before she recovered her diplomatic smile and gestured to Colonel Peterson, the senior military advisor, who began explaining the flexibility inherent in human tactical doctrine. But Throkkanen wasn't finished. Rising from his seat with a motion that made the deck plates vibrate, his forearms spreading in a gesture that Chen's cultural briefing identified as a challenge display. Perhaps your soldiers should observe real warriors in action, the Kalrathi champion announced, and his entire delegation rose with him, moving to the demonstration area with the synchronized precision of a species that had been fighting since before humans discovered fire. The demonstration was impressive, and Chun could admit that much even if he didn't care for the showboating. Watching the Kalrathi move through combat formations with speed that seemed impossible for creatures their size, they used weapons that looked like they weighed more than a full-grown human, swinging them with casual ease while their translator broadcast running commentary about the superiority of Kalrathi warrior traditions. Colonel Peterson's face had gone red, but he kept his mouth shut. And Chun respected that, even if it cost the man something, because starting a diplomatic incident on day one of first contact would be a career-ending mistake. The demonstration concluded with Throkkanen driving his primary weapon into a reinforced target dummy hard enough to split it in half, and the assembled delegates offered polite applause while the Kalrathi delegation radiated satisfaction. Now perhaps the humans would like to demonstrate their capabilities, Throkkanen announced through his translator, and the words carried an edge that made it clear this was not really a suggestion. Colonel Peterson started to decline, but Ambassador Williams touched his arm and nodded slightly, understanding the backing down now would color every future negotiation. So the colonel gestured to Chun and 3 other Marines who moved to the demonstration area with the silent efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times. They ran through basic formations without commentary, showing the flexibility that Throkanen had criticized, demonstrating how human squads could adapt and floor around obstacles while maintaining fields of fire. It was solid work and professional, but Chun could feel the disappointment radiating from the audience, because humans weren't doing anything that looked impressive compared to the Calrethi display of raw power. Your tactics assume your enemies will be patient, Throkanen observed, his massive form moving closer to the demonstration area uninvited. In real combat, warriors with courage would simply crush through your formations. Chun caught Colonel Peterson's eye and received a subtle nod. Permission to respond within appropriate boundaries. So he turned to face the Calrathi champion with the same neutral expression he'd maintained throughout the presentation. With respect, Warcast. Your formation assumes enemies will meet you head-on, Chun said, keeping his voice level and professional. The gap between your primary and secondary lines leaves you vulnerable to flanking maneuvers by smaller units. The observation deck went silent, and Chun could feel 40 species holding their collective breath. Because apparently no one had ever criticized Calrathi tactics before Throkanen's translator device made a sound that the briefing materials had identified as laughter mixed with rage. A combination that never ended well in any culture Chun had encountered. You dare to lecture me on tactics, little human? The translator's artificial voice somehow captured the contempt in Throkanen's native speech. Your species has barely left its birth world, and you presume to understand warfare? I presume to understand that every formation has weaknesses, Chun replied, still maintaining that careful, neutral tone. Recognition of weakness is the first step to correcting it. Throkanen moved faster than something his size had any right to move, crossing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. And Chun saw the strike coming, but had nowhere to go and no time to get there. Calrithi's lower right arm came around in a backhand that carried all the champion's mass behind it, striking Chun across the face with enough force to kill most species instantly. Ch felt his feet leave the deck and his vision went white with pain as he tumbled across the polished floor, tasting blood and hearing someone screaming orders in the distance. Impact should have killed him, and Throkanen clearly expected it to, because the Calrathi had already turned away to address the assembled delegates, his translator beginning some speech about teaching humans respect. But Marcus Chun had grown up in Earth's crushing gravity and survived 3 tours in conflicts that would have depopulated most peaceful species. And he had been hit before by explosions in vehicles and once memorably by a door that fell off its hinges. So, when his vision cleared and his equilibrium returned, Chun did what Marines do when someone knocks them down. He got back up. The observation deck fell absolutely silent as Chun found his feet, blood running from his mouth and nose, his jaw already swelling, but nothing felt broken. Throkan turned back, his 4 eyes widening in what might have been surprise, or might have been the Calrathi equivalent of respect. But whatever it was died quickly behind renewed rage. You should have stayed down. Human, the translator announced. Should have hit harder, Chun replied. And his hands came up in a fighting stance that had been refined by human warriors across thousands of years of continuous warfare somewhere. In the background, Ambassador Williams was shouting, and Colonel Peterson was trying to restore order. But Chun's world had narrowed to the 3 meters between him and the alien who thought humans were weak. 3 seconds. His instructor's voice echoed in his memory from Quantico all those years ago. That's all you get in real combat before the situation changes. 3 seconds to end the fight or die trying. Chun took 1 breath, and then he moved. The first second began with Chun closing the distance before Throkanen could process that his opponent was still moving, because the Calrathi champion had fought across 17 campaigns against 40 different species, and none of them got back up after a strike like that. Chun's combat training took over, and his conscious mind stepped back to let muscle memory guide him. Decades of Marine Corps martial arts combining with the simple physics of being born on a death world where gravity pulled harder than anywhere the Calrathi had ever evolved. Throken started to bring his upper arms around in a crushing embrace that would have pulped a human torso. But Chun was already inside the champion's reach. Too close for those massive limbs to generate proper leverage, the Calrathi warrior tried to adjust and bring his lower arms into play. Those secondary limbs that ended in natural bone spurs designed for close combat. But Chun had studied the briefing materials on the journey from Earth. Every species had weaknesses and evolution, was generous with some gifts while being cruel about the price. And the Calrathi's four-armed advantage came with joints that needed flexibility, which meant thinner exoskeletal plating at critical junctions. Chun's left hand found the nerve cluster where Throken's upper right arm connected to his torso. Fingers designed to grip and tear on a world where humanity's ancestors had hunted prey across endless plains until the animals literally died of exhaustion. The pressure point technique was old, refined by human warriors across millennia of fighting each other, because Earth never had the luxury of peace. And Chun's fingers drove into the gap between plates with surgical precision. Throken's translator made a sound that needed no translation. Pure pain that cut through whatever the Calrathi equivalent of shock was. And the champion's upper right arm went partially numb the second saw. Chun used that momentary advantage to shift his position, getting his hip under Throken's center of gravity, while his right hand found the secondary nerve cluster on the champion's lower left side. Human hands were remarkable things when you really thought about them, capable of both the delicate precision needed for surgery and the crushing grip strength required to strangle prey. And right now Chun needed every bit of that strength. Calrathi was already off balance from the first strike and trying to compensate with his still functional limbs. But Chun had learned throws from instructors who traced their lineage back to warriors in ancient Japan and wrestlers from a dozen different human traditions. It wasn't about being stronger than your opponent because someone was always going to be stronger. It was about using their strength against them and making physics do the work that muscle couldn't. Chun's hip became a fulcrum and Throken's massive weight became leverage. And the throw that followed used every principle of momentum transfer that human engineers had studied when they figured out how to launch themselves into space. The observation deck's reinforced floor was designed to handle diplomatic incidents and minor scuffles between species who didn't always see eye to eye. Built from composite materials that could withstand significant impacts without failing. Throken's skull hit that floor with his full mass behind it, plus the acceleration Chun had imparted through the throw. And the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot in a cathedral. The third second was almost anticlimactic because Throken wasn't getting up, and Chun stood over him with his hands still ready. His breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Blood was running down Chun's face from where the Calrathi's initial strike had split his cheek and probably fractured his jaw. But he'd been hurt worse and still finished missions because that's what Marines did. The silence in the observation deck was absolute, and Chun could feel 40 species staring at him with expressions his cultural briefing hadn't covered, because apparently humans getting up after lethal strikes and then winning fights against superior opponents wasn't in anyone's first contact protocol. Shrock Nan wasn't moving, and a medical team was rushing forward with equipment that looked both familiar and alien. Scanners and stretchers that worked on principles Chun didn't understand but could recognize by function. Colonel Peterson reached Chun first with hands that grabbed his shoulders and turned him away from the fallen Calrathi. And the colonel's face was white with either rage or fear or possibly both. Report? Gunny. Peterson's voice was tight and controlled, using rank and formality as a lifeline back to normalcy. "Self-defense, sir," Chun replied. And his voice came out thick because his jaw was definitely fractured now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Responded to lethal force with appropriate countermeasures. The medical team was working on Throkanan with increasing urgency, and Chun could see the Kalrathi delegation forming up behind their fallen champion. 4 warriors who looked ready to turn this diplomatic incident into a full-scale brawl, but Ambassador Williams was there suddenly, moving between the two groups with her hands raised, and her voice carrying authority that had nothing to do with physical size. "Everyone, stand down," she announced in a tone that suggested disobedience wasn't an option. "This incident will be investigated through proper channels under galactic law." The senior Kalrathi delegate was making sounds that the translator struggled with. Rage and grief mixing into something that needed no translation, demanding justice and calling for Chun's execution. Under warrior codes that humans had never agreed to follow. Peterson's grip on Chun's shoulders tightened, but the colonel's voice remained steady as he addressed the Kalrathi delegation. Warcast Throkanan initiated. Lethal force against a member of the human delegation, Peterson stated. And he gestured to the recording drones that had captured every moment of the presentation. Gunnery Sergeant Chun responded within the parameters of self-defense as recognized by council law. The argument that followed involved legal codes and precedents that Chun didn't fully understand because his training focused on tactical applications rather than diplomatic theory. But the core point was clear enough. Rokanen had struck first with intent to kill, and Chun had defended himself. And unless the council wanted to establish that humans had to accept lethal assault without response, they couldn't punish Chun without invalidating their own legal framework. The medical team was loading Throkanan onto a floating stretcher now, and their leader was making gestures that suggested things were not going well. The Kalrathi champion's exoskeleton cracked in fluids, leaking that probably shouldn't be outside his body. Chun felt something twist in his gut that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't quite satisfaction either, because he'd done what training demanded and survived an encounter that should have killed him. But watching the medical team work reminded him that the alien warrior was someone's brother or father or friend. The human will be confined pending investigation, the senior Kalrathi delegate announced through his translator, and the artificial voice somehow captured the barely restrained violence in the original speech. "If Warcast Throkanen dies, we will demand blood price under ancient law." Ambassador Williams started to argue, but Peterson shook his head slightly and guided Chun toward the exit. Because sometimes the best tactical decision was accepting a temporary setback to avoid a worse outcome. The other Marines fell in around them without orders, forming a protective cordon that suggested anyone trying to stop them would have another diplomatic incident to deal with. And the group moved through corridors filled with delegates who pressed themselves against the walls. Chin caught glimpses of their faces as he passed and saw fear mixed with fascination. Species who had thought they understood. Humans suddenly recalculating everything they believed about the small, soft creatures from Earth's quarters when they reached them were technically a holding cell, but nicer than most barracks he'd slept in. And Colonel Peterson stood in the doorway with an expression Chun couldn't quite read. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen. "Gunny," the colonel said finally. "Just doing my job." "Sir," Chun replied, and then his legs gave out as the adrenaline finally crashed and everything started to hurt. The last thing he saw before the medical team arrived was Peterson's face twisting into something between respect and concern. And then consciousness faded into chemical sleep while 40 species began the process of figuring out what humanity's presence really meant for the galaxy. The council chamber erupted into chaos within an hour of the incident, and representatives from 40 species demanded explanations, justice, or protection depending on their particular relationship with both humanity and the Calrathi Empire. Ambassador Williams stood before the assembled delegates with her diplomatic mask firmly in place. But anyone who knew her could see the tension in her shoulders as she fielded accusations that ranged from reasonable concerns to outright hysteria. The Calrathi delegation occupied the front section in full battle regalia, their translator devices broadcasting demands for Chun's immediate execution under warrior codes that predated humanity's discovery of agriculture. By several million years, the human attacked without provocation, the senior Calrathi representative announced, and his forearms spread in a gesture that their cultural database identified as righteous indignation. Warcast Throkanan merely corrected the human's impertinence with appropriate discipline. Williams let the translator finish before she activated the holographic display that every recording drone in the observation deck had captured, showing Throkanan's backhand strike from 17 different angles with timestamps that proved beyond any doubt who initiated violence. Warcast Throkanan struck Gunnery Sergeant Chun with lethal force, Williams stated, her voice carrying across the chamber with the kind of calm that came from years of navigating political minefields. Under council law, species members have the right to defend themselves from lethal assault. The debate that followed involved legal precedents and treaty obligations that would take weeks to fully unpack. But the core issue was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. If the council punished Chun for defending himself, they established that humans had to accept being killed without response, which would make Earth's membership meaningless and possibly hostile. But if they exonerated Chun, they had to acknowledge that a human had defeated a Calrathi champion in single combat, which challenged assumptions about human capabilities that dozens of species had built their diplomatic strategies around the Thorian. Delegate raised a manipulator appendage that signaled a desire to speak, and the chamber fell silent because the Thorians rarely involved themselves in military disputes. This council must consider what the human did, not merely whether it was legal, the Thorian announced through his translation matrix. The footage shows Warcast Throkanan struck with force sufficient to kill most species. Yet the human rose and countered with precision that suggests extensive study of Calrathi physiology. The observation hit the chamber like a cold wind, and suddenly delegates were requesting copies of the footage for analysis, their various military advisors already pulling up data on human biology and Earth's environmental conditions. Discoveries that followed over the next several hours would reshape galactic politics in ways that no one could have predicted during humanity's first contact. Negotiations. A xenobiology team from the Assembly Collective published their analysis first, showing that Earth's gravity was roughly 40% higher than galactic standard, which meant every human was effectively carrying extra mass that their bones and muscles had evolved to support. The military implications were obvious once someone pointed them out, because a species that evolved in high gravity would have bone density and muscle strength beyond what their size suggested. Then, the tactical analysts started dissecting Chun's movements frame by frame, identifying techniques that suggested human martial traditions went back thousands of years with continuous refinement through actual combat application. Most species had abandoned personal combat once they developed ranged weapons and shields, treating hand-to-hand fighting as a historical curiosity rather than a practical skill. Humans apparently had never stopped fighting each other up close and personal, refining techniques through generation after generation of warfare that continued even after they reached the stars. The psychological profiles were perhaps most disturbing to species that prided themselves on peaceful coexistence, because the analysts kept using words like persistence predator An endurance hunter to describe humanity's evolutionary background. Earth's most successful predator wasn't the fastest or strongest. It was the species that could track prey for days across hostile terrain until the target literally died of exhaustion. And now the predator species was standing in the council chamber asking to join the galactic community, while one of their warriors was confined for nearly killing a champion from the galaxy's most feared military culture ambassador. Williams watched the analysis spread through the delegates and saw the exact moment when fear began replacing contempt in their expressions. Because fear she could work with, while contempt would have crippled any future negotiations. The human will remain confined pending full investigation, the council speaker announced after 6 hours of debate. But we acknowledge that preliminary evidence supports the claim of self-defense. The Galrathi delegation made sounds that suggested profound disagreement. But they didn't walk out of the chamber, which meant they were at least willing to follow council procedures. Williams returned to the human delegation's quarters to find Colonel Peterson coordinating with Earth Command. And the colonel's expression suggested the conversation had not been going well. Washington wants to recall the entire delegation, Peterson explained without preamble. They're worried this incident will torpedo our council membership before it even begins. Tell them the incident might be the best thing that could have happened, Williams replied. And she pulled up the analysis reports that were flooding through diplomatic channels. Half the council is terrified of us now, which means the other half wants us as allies. Peterson read through the reports with an expression that cycled between professional interest and personal concern. Because his gunny was sitting in a cell while xenobiologists debated whether humans were secretly super soldiers. How's Shun holding up? Williams asked. Even though she wasn't sure, she wanted to know the answer. Medical team says his jaw was fractured, but he refused the sedation because he wanted to be alert for questioning, Peterson replied. The man literally took a hit that should have killed him, and his main concern is whether he followed proper rules of engagement. The investigation proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that would have been impressive if it wasn't determining whether Chun faced execution or exoneration. And every piece of evidence that emerged supported the self-defense claim. 3 days after the incident, medical reports on Throkinus' condition started leaking through channels that Williams suspected were deliberately opened by species who wanted humanity to understand the stakes. The Galrathi champion had suffered catastrophic skull fractures and neurological damage that would have killed most species immediately. But Galrathi physiology was remarkably resilient, and he was expected to survive. Expected to survive, but not expected to fight again. And for a war-cast warrior, that might be worse than death. Williams found herself in the strange position of hoping that Throkinan lived while simultaneously knowing his survival would complicate everything. Because dead warriors became martyrs, but wounded warriors could testify. The xenobiology reports kept coming, and each one revealed new details about human capabilities that made the other species increasingly nervous. Humans had faster reflexes than 80% of known species, bone density that exceeded most military-grade armor materials, and a pain tolerance that suggested their homeworld was significantly more hostile than anyone had realized. One report from a Velen researcher actually used the phrase naturally militarized to describe human physiology, suggesting that Earth had produced warriors through simple evolutionary pressure rather than genetic modification. The political implications spread beyond the immediate incident as various species began requesting bilateral meetings with the human delegation, their diplomatic language carefully avoiding the word alliance while making it clear they wanted humanity on their side. The Galrathi delegation remained hostile, but even they seemed to be recalculating their position as more data emerged. Because having humans as enemies suddenly looked significantly more expensive than it had during first. Contact Williams was reviewing the latest batch of meeting requests when her communicator chimed with an urgent priority flag. And the message that followed would change everything again. Warcast Throkanan had regained consciousness and was demanding to speak with the council. And under Kalarathi law, his testimony would carry more weight than any amount of analysis or legal precedent. Colonel Peterson joined Williams as they made their way to the medical wing. Both of them understanding that the next few hours would determine not just Chun's fate, but humanity's entire relationship with the galactic community. The Kalarathi warrior was conscious, but clearly diminished. His massive frame supported by medical equipment that looked both sophisticated and uncomfortable. His translator device activated as Williams and Peterson entered. And the artificial voice somehow captured the weakness in Throkanan's natural speech. "I wish to address the council regarding the human warrior," the champion announced. And his four eyes focused on Williams with an intensity that suggested whatever was coming next would not be simple. The council chamber assembled with unusual speed, considering that most galactic bureaucracy moved at a pace that made glaciers look hurried. But apparently, a Kalarathi warcast demanding to testify got attention that normal procedures couldn't command. Throkan entered the chamber supported by medical equipment and flanked by his delegation. His massive frame diminished by injury, but his presence still commanding respect from species who understood what it meant when a warrior appeared before enemies, while wounded Ambassador Williams watched from the human delegation's section and tried to read the Kalarathi champion's body language through her limited understanding of their cultural signals, wondering if this testimony would damn Chun or somehow salvage the situation. The council speaker acknowledged Throkanan with the formal gestures that ancient protocol demanded, and the chamber fell silent as the Kalarathi's translator began broadcasting his words. "I stand before this council to speak truth about the incident that brought me low," Throkanan announced, and his four eyes surveyed the assembled delegates with an intensity that suggested he was measuring each species for their worthiness to hear what came next. "Struck the human called Chun because I deemed him impertinent," the champion continued, his translator somehow capturing the weight of each word. "I sought to demonstrate Kalarathi superiority and teach these newcomers proper respect for warriors who have defended the council for generations." Williams felt her stomach drop because this sounded like the opening of a demand for justice under ancient laws that didn't recognize concepts like proportional response. But Throkanan wasn't finished, and what came next wasn't what anyone expected. "I struck to kill," the Kalarathi stated flatly, and the chamber erupted in whispers that the speaker quickly silenced. "I used force sufficient to end most species and expected the human to fall and not rise again." Throkan's translator paused as the champion shifted his weight, and his medical equipment adjusted to compensate for the movement. "The human rose," he said simply. And those three words carried implications that rippled through every delegate present. He rose and he fought with precision that I have seen only in warriors who have studied combat across multiple lifetimes. The xenobiology reports had suggested human capabilities, but hearing a Kalarathi champion confirm them gave the data a weight that analysis couldn't match. "I have fought across 17 campaigns," Throkanan continued, and his forearms gestured in patterns that the cultural database identified as a recitation of honored history. "I have defeated champions from 40 species and never once questioned my superiority in personal combat. The human defeated me in 3 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute, because everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A Kalarathi warcast admitting defeat before the entire council. He targeted nerve clusters that only Kalarathi military medicine understands, Throkanan explained. And his translator somehow made the admission sound like respect rather than accusation. He used leverage and technique to turn my own strength against me. And when I felt he could have continued, but chose to stop. William saw where this was going and had to suppress the urge to interrupt, because sometimes the best diplomatic move was letting events unfold without interference. Under Calrathi warrior law, there is honor in combat and honor in defeat when that defeat is earned, the champion announced. And his delegation shifted behind him in what looked like agreement. The human Chun fought with honor and showed mercy when he could have shown none. The council speaker leaned forward in his seat, and his translation matrix conveyed careful interest as he addressed the Calrathi. Directly Warcast Throkanen. Are you withdrawing your delegation's demand for blood price? I am stating that no blood price is owed, Throkanen replied. And the distinction was apparently important in Calrathi legal tradition. I initiated lethal combat and was defeated by a superior warrior. This is the way of honorable conflict. The political implications were already spreading through the chamber as delegates recalculated their positions based on this new information. Because a Calrathi champion calling a human a superior warrior changed every assumption about Earth's military capabilities, but Throkanen had one more revelation that would reshape the conversation entirely. I wish to request private audience with the human warrior Chun, the champion announced. And the chamber fell silent again because this was clearly outside normal protocol. The council speaker looked to Ambassador Williams, who nodded slightly. Understanding that refusing such a request would insult both the Calrathi and potentially damage Chun's position 2 hours later. Chun stood in Throkanen's medical suite under guard from both human marines and Calrathi warriors. The two fighters facing each other across a cultural divide that seemed suddenly less wide than anyone had thought. Chun's jaw had been repaired by human medical technology, but his face still showed bruising. That would take days to fade. And Throkanen's skull was encased in medical support equipment that monitored his neurological functions. You could have killed me, Throkanen stated through his translator. And the artificial voice carried curiosity rather than accusation. Why did you stop? Chun considered the question with the same careful thought he applied to tactical problems, understanding that his answer would carry weight beyond this private conversation. Because you were no longer a threat, Chun replied simply. My training teaches threat elimination, not revenge. Your training, Throkanen repeated. And his four eyes studied Chun with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Tell me of this training that defeats Calrathi champions. What followed was a conversation that neither warrior had anticipated. Chun explaining the evolution of human martial arts across thousands of years of continuous warfare, describing how different cultures developed different techniques and then shared them through conflict and cooperation. He talked about how humans fought with weapons and without them, how they studied leverage and pressure points and the psychology of combat, how every disadvantage became something to study and overcome. A Throkan listened with the focus of a professional learning from another professional, asking questions that demonstrated his own deep understanding of combat theory. Your species never stopped fighting, the Calrathi observed after Chun finished explaining the basics of human military history. Even after reaching the stars, you continue to refine techniques for killing each other. Yes, Chun admitted, because there was no point in denying what the historical records would show anyway. Humanity has never known galactic peace because we never achieved planetary peace, and this makes you strong, Throkanen stated. And it wasn't quite a question. This makes us prepared, Chun corrected. And he gestured to his own injuries and then to Throkanen's medical equipment. Strong is relative, but preparedness is universal. The Calrathi champion made a sound that his translator interpreted as thoughtful agreement. And his next words would later be quoted across the galaxy. "We train to be strong," Throkanen said slowly, working through ideas that clearly challenged his cultural assumptions. "You train so you don't have to be the strongest. We train so when strength fails, we have skill," Chun replied. "And when skill fails, we have will." The conversation continued for another hour. Two warriors from different worlds finding common ground and shared understanding of combat and its role in shaping civilizations. When Chun finally left the medical suite, he found Colonel Peterson waiting with an expression that suggested important news. The council just announced their decision. Peterson explained, "Full exoneration and official apology from both the council and the Calrathi delegation." Chun nodded because he'd expected something like this after Throkanen's testimony. But Peterson wasn't finished. "There's more," the colonel continued. "The Calrathi delegation released a statement supporting the decision. And Throkanen is writing some kind of paper about human combat doctrine." "Sir?" Chen wasn't sure he'd heard that correctly. "Apparently your conversation impressed him," Peterson explained with something that might have been amusement. "He's calling it the Death World Doctrine, and early excerpts are already circulating through military channels. The paper that Throkanen would eventually publish would become required reading in galactic military academies, analyzing how humanity's evolutionary background on a high-gravity world with continuous warfare had created combat doctrines that differed fundamentally from species that evolved in more peaceful environments." His central thesis was simple but profound. Humanity didn't fight to win. They fought to survive. And that subtle distinction meant human warriors would continue fighting long after other species would have surrendered. The publication spread through diplomatic and military circles with speed that suggested people had been waiting for someone with Throkanen's credibility to articulate what the footage of the fight had implied, and in quiet conversations across 40 species, military commanders began requesting information about human training methods, while politicians started drafting treaty proposals. That the formal exoneration came with ceremony that Ambassador Williams had negotiated carefully to avoid either triumphalism or the appearance of human weakness. And Chun stood before the council in his dress blues while the speaker read the official findings. The investigation had been thorough and the conclusion unanimous. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chun had acted within the boundaries of self-defense under council law and would face no punishment for his actions during the diplomatic incident. Calrathi delegation stood in formation as their senior representative approached Chun with movements that suggested this was important in ways that human cultural briefings hadn't covered. The Calrathi Empire acknowledges that honor was satisfied in combat, the representative announced through his translator, and he performed a gesture with his forearms that the database identified as a warrior salute between equals. "We withdraw claims against the human Chun and recognize his status as a warrior of merit." What happened next caught Chun completely off guard because Throkanen himself entered the chamber in his medical support chair, his massive frame still showing the damage from their encounter, but his presence commanding attention that no amount of injury could diminish. "I have written an analysis of human combat doctrine," the Calrathi champion announced, and he transmitted the document to every delegate simultaneously. "I believe the council should review this material before making final decisions about humanity's military integration." The paper spread through the chamber's network, and delegates began reading with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern, because Throkanen's reputation meant his analysis would carry significant weight. Williams had seen an early draft and knew what was coming, so she watched the delegates' faces as they encountered Throkanen's central argument. Humanity represented a completely new paradigm in galactic military thinking. The humans do not fight like other species. Throkanen's Maz paper stated in its opening section, They evolved as persistent predators on a high-gravity death world, where survival required continuous adaptation to threats that would have eliminated most species. The analysis went deeper than simple xenobiology, examining how human military history showed continuous refinement of combat techniques even during periods of relative peace, how human cultures shared and improved upon each other's martial traditions through both cooperation and conflict. But the section that was already causing intense debate among military professionals focused on what Throkkinen called the survival doctrine. Most galactic species fought to achieve specific objectives and withdrew when those objectives became too costly to pursue, treating warfare as a tool for advancing interests with acceptable losses. Humans fought until they won or until they physically couldn't continue fighting, treating warfare as an existential struggle where surrender meant extinction, even when the actual stakes were far less extreme. The psychological implications were disturbing to species that had spent millennia developing diplomatic solutions to conflicts, because it suggested humans would be more difficult to negotiate with once combat started. The council speaker finally cleared his throat and addressed the chamber after giving delegates time to review the key sections. Warcast Throkkinen, your analysis suggests significant concerns about human military integration. The speaker stated carefully, "Does the Kilrathi Empire have recommendations for how the council should proceed?" Throkkinen's translator conveyed what might have been amusement as the champion replied, "I recommend we hire them immediately." The chamber erupted in crosstalk, and the speaker spent several minutes restoring order while delegates demanded explanations, and Throkkinen waited with the patience of someone who had anticipated this reaction. "The humans defeated me not through superior strength, but through superior preparation," the champion explained once the chamber quieted. "Every species here can learn from their methods, and those who don't learn will be at a disadvantage against those who do." Williams saw several military advisors nodding agreement, even as their diplomatic counterparts looked concerned, because the strategic logic was sound even if the cultural implications were uncomfortable. The Kilrathi Empire proposes a joint military training initiative. Throkkinen continued, "We will contribute our experience with conventional warfare, and the humans will share their tactical innovations and close combat doctrines." The proposal was brilliant politics because it gave the Kilrathi a face-saving way to learn from the species that had defeated their champion, while also acknowledging human capabilities in a framework that other species could accept. Ambassador Williams stood to address the council before anyone could object to the Kilrathi proposal. "Humanity accepts the Kilrathi Empire's suggestion," she announced, and she transmitted a formal proposal that her team had been preparing since Throkkinen's testimony. "We're prepared to establish an integrated training program with council oversight and participation from any species that wishes to contribute." The debate that followed involved details about locations and command structures and oversight mechanisms. But the fundamental question had already been answered. Humanity's military capabilities were real and valuable enough that the council wanted access to them. 3 months later, Chun found himself standing in front of a formation that would have seemed impossible during first contact negotiations. 200 warriors from 17 different species stood at attention in a training facility that the council had constructed specifically for the integrated program. And Chun's cultural briefing suggested that at least half of them were larger and physically stronger than any Humanthrockman was there too. No longer in his medical chair, but moving with a noticeable limp that would never fully heal. Serving as the Kilrathi cultural liaison and senior advisor on warrior traditions, Chun had been offered promotion to master sergeant and a position as chief instructor, which he'd accepted on one condition: that Colonel Peterson had supported enthusiastically. If the galaxy wanted to learn how humans fought, they would learn the complete doctrine without political dilution or diplomatic softening, because warriors deserved training that would keep them alive rather than training that looked good in reports. "My name is Gunnery Sergeant Chen," he announced, and his voice carried across the formation without electronic amplification, because projection was one of the first things you learned in the Marines. "I'm here to teach you how humans approach combat." He walked the line slowly, making eye contact with warriors who ranged from species that looked vaguely humanoid to ones that didn't share any recognizable anatomical features. "Some of you are stronger than me," Chen continued, and he stopped in front of a Thorian whose bulk made Throkanen look small. "Some of you are faster. Some have natural weapons that humans can only dream about." "Good," Chen stated flatly. "That means you'll survive the training." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Human combat doctrine assumes you're at a disadvantage," Chen explained, and he gestured to himself as an example. "We evolved on a world where we weren't the strongest, fastest, or most naturally armed predators. So we learned to win through preparation, adaptability, and refusal to quit." Throkanen moved forward to stand beside Chen, and the Kalrathi champion's translator broadcast his next words to the entire formation. "The human defeated me because I assumed strength was enough," Throkanen announced. "I assumed my experience and natural advantages would overcome any technique he could employ. I was wrong," the champion continued, "and that mistake nearly cost my life." Chen picked up the lesson from there. "We're not going to teach you to fight like humans," he stated, and several warriors looked confused because that seemed to contradict the program's entire purpose. "We're going to teach you to think like humans when you fight. There's a difference," Chen explained, and he signaled for the formation to break into training groups. "Techniques are species-specific, but principles are universal." What followed over the next 6 months would become the foundation for integrated training programs across the Council's military structure. Chen and his team of human instructors didn't try to make Kalrathi fight like Marines or teach Thorians human grappling, techniques that their anatomy couldn't support. Instead, they taught the fundamental principles that had allowed humanity to survive and thrive despite being relative newcomers to warfare. Compared to species that have been fighting for millions of years, they taught tactical flexibility and the importance of having backup plans for your backup plans. They taught how to turn environmental disadvantages into advantages through creative thinking. They taught how to analyze an opponent's strengths and find the weaknesses that every strength created, and, most importantly, they taught the warrior's mindset that had carried humanity through countless conflicts. You fight until you win or until you can't fight anymore, and everything else is just details. The results exceeded even Ambassador Williams's optimistic projections. As warriors from across the council returned to their units with new approaches to training and tactical problems, 6 months into the program, Chen received a message that made him pause during a training session. Warcast Throkanen had been cleared to return to limited duty and had requested assignment as a permanent liaison to the human training program.